Good afternoon. My name is Christopher Eaglin. I'm an assistant professor of strategy here at the Fuqua School of Business at Duke University. Thank you so much for coming to my LinkedIn Live talk. I'm excited to share with you all the focus of my research, which is how small and medium-sized enterprises should build inclusive and resilient economies, or how they can contribute to building inclusive and resilient economies. The structure of the talk will go as follows. So first, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and what motivates my research. Then I'll talk about why I think these small and medium-sized enterprises are really important to study. And then I'll take examples from my research about what we can learn from these firms and how we can apply that to business more broadly. Okay, let's get started. So I study things at the intersection of strategy, economic development, and entrepreneurship. And in particular, I'm interested in understanding how firms can set strategies that increase the prevalence of inclusive and sustainable economies. And I'm particularly interested in how entrepreneurs and small firms do that. Now, what motivates this question? As many of you will know, climate change is accelerating, and that's causing lots of disruptions. So we know that there are more high impact events and they are more frequent. And those high impact events are causing droughts, floods, and straining infrastructure in the US and around the world. And that strain on infrastructure is also causing a lot of public good problems. At the same time, inequality is increasing all around the world, particularly in developed markets. The more inequality, the less stability there is. And one thing that I find particularly salient is that's led to the average citizen preferences not being taken into consideration by policymakers, while the elite preferences have been taken into account by policymakers. And this has caused a lot of stress in our institutions of the system and distrust. And one of the things that I'm really interested about in this setting and this uncertainty is what exactly should firms be doing? And to put a more fine point on it, what strategies should firms pursue that would lead to a sustainable and flourishing society? Now, I'm not the first person to ask this question. And in fact, we had sets of firms that we thought were going to do this not too long ago. So about 30 years ago, a new set of firms came onto the market and they promised to do exactly that. If you recall, back in 1995 and onwards, we had things like Netscape, Google, and they promised that they would do no evil. They would just add good things to the world. In addition, we saw broad-based equity compensation in these firms. So the idea was that there was going to be this huge wealth transfer from productivity of firms to the employee base. And on top of that, we were told if you are working on something exciting that you really care about, you don't need to be pushed. The vision pulls you. That comes from Steve Jobs, that we should bring our whole self to work. And while these firms have added a lot of value, they've come with a lot of problems. So since the advent of a lot of social media technology, major depression has gone up in the US quite significantly for girls and boys. We know that there's been a lot of commentary about how these firms aren't doing all that they say they should have done. We know that they've designed products that keep users on devices and platforms in an addictive fashion. We know that this addiction increases polarization. We know that it also decreases mental health and safety. And we know this is broadly contributing to social cleavages. In addition to this, we know that executives at these companies have known these effects for years, yet pursue strategies to increase our reliance on them. And so while they produced a lot of value, they've also produced a lot of things that we might like for them not to do. And so this begs the question, if we want to figure out, well, how can firms contribute to inclusive, sustainable economies, where else can we look for examples? And I would argue that we should examine small and medium-sized firms and underdeveloped markets. And we should do two things in that inquiry. One, we should seek to support them. And two, we should seek to learn from them. So when you think about supporting small and medium-sized businesses, It's important to know that they represent 90 to 95% of companies, 70% of employment, and 40% of GDP. They're often focused on delivering goods and services to underserved populations. They provide personal projects that individuals can control, invest in, develop, grow, and see to fruition. And this enables deep satisfaction, often missing from working for large conglomerates whose dictates are decided by faraway elites. And in total, they are critical to the construction of inclusive, sustainable communities as they are sources of employment, wealth accumulation, innovation, and community stability. So it's really important for us to think about how can we further support these firms? How can we make them more successful and better serve their communities? The second thing that's worth considering is we stand to learn a lot from studying them. So given their embeddedness with their communities, they are already enacting knowledge production and strategies that serve them and their communities. So we can learn, what does it mean to be closer to your community, and how can you develop strategies that better sustain them? As climate change and geopolitical instability accelerate and uncertainty increases, firms will increasingly find themselves in institutionally incomplete and uncertain environments. And that can lead to a lot of disjunctures, but these firms are already thinking about that in real time. The other thing that's worth considering is the large sample size and lower level complexity of these firms can help us overcome methodological challenges that we often find in the management and strategy field. When you only study 10, 20, 30 big firms, it's hard to know what exactly is leading to what, and thinking about strong correlations or causal attribution. So studying smaller firms can help us get closer to that. And that means that there are fertile ground to test existing theory and uncover new paradigms. So what I'm going to talk to you about are two ideas that I've encountered that I think are really worthwhile in considering how we think about these smaller firms. The first is that a lot of these firms are financed through debt. And by that I mean they apply for loans, those loans have variable rates, and they repay them over time. What's really important to note here is about 70% of small firms are financed through some sort of debt facility or vehicle. And this is a really important understudied aspect of their behavior. How does debt play into the strategies that they set? The other thing that I'd like to provide to you is that they really focus on using their assets well. So a lot of these firms don't have funds to focus on research and development, aren't at the forefront of innovation, yet they still provide meaningful livelihoods for the people who own them and work there. And they do so by taking assets that others have developed and trying to use them the best that they can. And what's really important to note here is those firms that are really good at managing their debt and managing asset utilization tend to have outsized rewards and are more sustainable and productive. And this can help us think through a core question in the strategy literature, which more broadly asks us, why do we see similar sized firms have very disparate outcomes? Why do we see similar sized enterprises have persistent performance differences? And these two concepts can help us think about that. Now, I study these concepts in the context of the minibus taxi industry in South Africa. Now, why do I spend so much time at the bottom of the world with these small firms? What's really important to know about this industry is it provides transport for over 15 million people daily. It's the primary mode of transport for 80% of the population. That means the majority of the people are using this means of transport. And it is similar to informal and semi-formal transportation globally that serves about 1 billion commuters every day. Now, like in other settings, the minibus taxi industry is privately run with little regulatory oversight. There's no public subsidy or planning from the government. They're organized into associations that control entry into the market, determine routes, set prices, and enforce non-compliance. Now, even though there's a high degree of uncertainty, what they are able to do is provide reliable transportation for the majority of the population. So, although in South Africa, health, power, water, education has failed in many cases for the disadvantaged populations, the minibus taxi industry gets up every day and gets the country to work. There wouldn't be a building or a plant or an office that would be able to open if it weren't for this industry. And therefore, they're very, very essential to the way the economy works. Not only do they provide this essential service, they're one of the few pathways to upper income for the historically disadvantaged population. And what that means is in a place of really high unemployment, this not only provides high service, but it also provides a pathway for income generation. So let me tell you about the data I've collected here. So I have a proprietary data set from a minibus taxi financing company in South Africa. They have a portfolio of about 50,000 vehicles, representing about 14% of the market. They provide financing and insurance products to their clients. And each vehicle, they place a GPS device that they finance, providing exact locational data every 6 seconds. And this provides trillions of observations that are condensed to provide information on driving behavior of vehicles, which I've constructed to use as proxies for asset utilization. In addition to this observational data set, I've done over 100 hours of semi-structured interviews, multiple waves of surveys, and over 100 hours of ride-alongs in minibus taxis to really understand what's going on with this industry, what's driving this data, how can we get insights from them. So I'm going to bring forward two ideas at this intersection. The first is high interest rates, high debt burdens, and strategic misconduct. And what I mean by strategic misconduct are what are the sets of actions that firms undertake to be profitable, but break the laws and norms that society would seek for them to avoid. So for those of you who may know the minibus taxi industry in South Africa, they are known for driving very quickly and quite recklessly. And when you talk to minibus taxi owners, they will tell you one of the reasons that they do this, a primary reason that they do this, is because they have excessive debt burden. They have really high interest rates, they have high monthly installment payments, and it's difficult for them to make them. And what this graph below shows is that, at least to a first approximation, this correlation seems to be correct. As interest rates go up, it seems that so does the average speeding alert that you have over the life of the minibus taxi. And what I mean by average speeding alert is how often do you go over 120 kilometers per hour when the national speed limit for taxis is 100. Now, to disentangle interest rates and strategic misconduct, I use a violent national strike by the taxi industry in 2017, which stopped traffic nationally, protesting unaffordability of debt, and they presented demands to government and financiers. This action led to a decrease in debt burden for operators moving forward. So the strike led to the company, the financing company that I work with, lowering interest rates by 2 percentage points and starting assigning proportionally lower rates. And what this has led to is for people who receive financing after the strike, they decreased speeding by about 10%, and there was a 12% decrease in collisions over the intervening 18-month period. What we can take away from this is that lower debt burdens might decrease strategic misconduct by firms. They can increase the likelihood of firm survival, and they can also increase social welfare, in this case, safety. Another idea that I'd like to leave with you is this idea of how do we think about asset utilization more closely, and how does that interact with the debt burden? So a lot of firms, when they get an asset, the maximum productivity they have with that asset is very early on in their life cycle, and the minibus taxi industry is no different. So what this graph shows is that the majority of firms earn the most early on, and then as that asset depreciates, so does their revenue generating ability. Also, firms tend not to earn in a steady fashion. They earn cyclically, so they earn around major holidays, major times when there's sales, and the minibus taxi industry works in the same way. So around Christmas and Easter, they do the most routes, and that's when they earn the most money. And this provides asymmetry with debt because debt is collected on a monthly basis at a steady state. And these firms do not earn money in that kind of way. So what we've done is experiment with debt rehabilitation. So we modify contracts for indebted borrowers. We offer them 3 options that they opted out of. And then we saw how did their behavior change. And so what we see is that there was a 10 to 13% improvement in repayments as a result of participating in our experiment. And most of the improvement came from firms with used assets and who are given lower payments. So those firms that received debt reduction in the form of lower monthly installments, as you recall, most operators said that is what really made it difficult for them. They were able not only to increase the amount of money that they paid in, so the revenue that they earned, they also were able to increase their asset utilization. So they literally spent more days working and they went further on the days that they did work. And what we take away from that is that they were depressed by the amount of debt burden. They felt they could never pay it off. And so they underinvested in asset utilization. And that relief increased their ability to see their way out of this contract and therefore increased their performance. And what this means for implications for debt rehabilitation is that excess debt decreases the incentive to perform. And that reduction in debt can improve performance for both the lender and the firm. And in this case, given they're providing this critical social service for society more broadly. So just to wrap up, as I've talked about, I'm interested in research at the intersection of strategy, entrepreneurship, and economic development. And I firmly believe that focusing on small and medium-sized firms in underdeveloped markets where we spent less time, can lead to insights that are helpful both for businesses as they operate today and for academic research more broadly. And most importantly, I think that can help us think through how can we build more resilient and sustainable economies. So a couple things that I've talked about: higher interest rates can lead to excessive debt burdens. Those burdens can lead to strategic misconduct and premature firm death. The improvement of those debt burdens can increase optimal asset utilization, and this can improve performance for both firms and create a society that we're much more interested in achieving. And what I'll leave you with is, if you are an entrepreneur, if you are a financier, if you're a large corporation, these are things that you really should think about as you start or work with small businesses. That excessive debt burdens can lead to underperformance, and the relief of those debt burdens can improve the performance of the business as well as the actions that they take. Thank you so much. I look forward to questions. So one thing that the first question that I've gotten, and I often get this question, is how can we think about what the minibus taxi industry does for us in terms of learning for businesses more broadly around the world. And it is true that the minibus taxi industry in South Africa is unique, as all settings are unique. So yes, they have consistent assets. Yes, they have an unregulated space, but they are optimizing over a huge set of decisions that are very complicated. And those decisions are something that they have to toggle with. And this excessive debt burden and this choice of asset utilization can be hindered, or they can hinder how profitable they are in that way. And so just like firms find themselves having to make a lot of different interlocking decisions, these firms operate in the same kind of way. The other thing that's really important to note about them is that they aren't what you would call push carts. it's actually quite expensive to purchase a taxi relative to income in South Africa. So purchasing a minibus taxi in South Africa um, is 10, 20 times what the average Black South African would earn in a year. And to get into the industry, they also have to pay an entry fee. And so it's not uncommon for a minibus taxi operator to have to shell out a million and a half rand, which equivalent, can be the equivalent of about $500,000, $750,000 in terms of purchasing power parity. And that's a really, really huge entry decision. It's not something that's easy to do. It's not just you go on the side of the road and put a card up. These are people who are sophisticated in that, although they're not highly educated, they know their business very well, and they've done well enough to get into this part of the industry. So another question I have is, what features about small, medium-sized firms would make them important for building resilient economies? So I'll answer this in a couple ways. The first is that when you go out your door, you interact with SMEs all the time. Your plumber, your carpenter, most of the stores you go to, a lot of them are run by or interact with small businesses. Supply chains are suffused with small businesses. And that has huge implications for the quality of service that you receive and the kind of employment opportunities that are available in a particular community. So it's not uncommon for large firms to really struggle with their supply chains because they haven't figured out how to get the best out of the small, medium-sized businesses that serve them. And so this kind of research can help us think about, well, how do we get more out of those firms? And at the same time, how can those firms provide better services, both for the companies that they interact with and for the communities that they serve in terms of employment, whatnot. Another thing that's really important to note is a lot of small firms are located in the communities that they serve. And so they have a really keen sense of what's going on in the community. How do we think about, addressing those needs? And they're able to adopt to local needs much more quickly than larger firms would be able to. And they're more able to be held accountable to those in their community as well. Another question, do I see any differences in the US system that make the debt measures outlined difficult to implement? So the good thing about what we've done with the minibus taxi financing company is they've chosen to engage in this experimentation of their own accord. So they're a publicly traded company. They, go along in the business cycles, and they realize that they need to better attune their business to the way in which their operators work to be more profitable themselves. And so one thing that we've learned is if you're able to engage with these companies and convince them to vary debt burdens, it can be not only profitable for the firms that they're working with, but also for the financier itself. So over the course of the year that we did this experiment, we saved this financier about 50 million in local currency, which is a really big deal. Just to give context to what that means, this experiment and the savings from that paid for the entirety of the C-suite for 2024. So there's a lot that companies not just in South Africa and emerging markets, but in developed markets can learn from this and save as a result of being very thoughtful about how to do debt rehabilitation. So I think I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you all so much for coming to my talk. I'm glad to have an opportunity to share my research and the insights that I have built from that. Thank you so much to the LinkedIn Live team. I look forward to questions and more discussions moving forward.